That's
Assuming we don't get
magical.
carried away.
So I'm thinking we like record this. If it's good, we upload it. If not, it's an experience.
I
It's an
think if we
experience and an
record it, I'm
experiment.
showing it to people anyway, even if it's not going on like the YouTubes or whatever. So, yeah.
Yes, well, it will be an experience in any event because did we lose you, Chris? Did you freeze?
Looks like he's frozen. Yes.
No. I was just gonna make a Whitehead joke for him. Everything is an experience after all, right? But oh,
Yes,
back.
I froze. I'm back. I'm back.
You're just not a
All
process
right.
philosopher, I guess, Chris.
I'm not a process philosopher.
You're frozen
Yeah.
in eternity.
No, it was just an
No,
abstraction,
I
a
like to-
temporal abstraction.
I like to think of this as like Schillingian buffering. So
Great.
so it's okay. Oh my God, we're all such nerds.
Well, I love your idea of bouncing a concept around. We can kind of play philosophical hot potato or something, and each reflect on its significance for us. Did you have a set of ideas or concepts?
Do you want to hear the funniest story? It's like 3 a.m. my time here, and Nal was asking me this funniest question. He's like, "Yo, what about Forrest Gump?" And I was like, Forrest Gump is the most Deleuzian movie in the entire world. And he went, why do you think it's the most Deleuzian movie in the world? I'm like, because he's a body without organs. He has no personality. He can join he's a line of flight that can join any single situation with Bubba. He's just like this practical person that just like jumps into everything.
Mhm.
We were going to go with that, but we're not going to do that. But anyways.
I've always thought that like Forrest Gump was just like catnip for baby boomers. Like, it is. Like, it's just a self-important dribble where like, oh, we just showed up at like every like significant moment of history where we didn't do anything, and then we just became a bunch of narcissists in the 80s. I mean, I don't know. That movie has not aged well.
What about weeds? Weeds, you don't want weeds at all. Deleuze loves weeds. They just pop up everywhere. And they're not good for anything.
Well, if you're like a right Deleuzian, I guess Forrest Gump
Right.
would be like a good movie. But like, it's just
I know.
too much boomer energy for me.
Did you say boomer energy?
Yes, I'm way too much. I'm way too much online. So.
Okay.
That's to conclude that Deleuze's spirit animal was a dandelion. That's what I'm getting from this, guys.
And dandelions are good in salads. Okay. That's where this
News to
ends.
me.
New concept. Nathan just ruined it. He's just like, no, man, this is a terrible concept. This is not a leftist movie idea. No, I'm just joking. I'm just kidding.
Well, what about the philosophical significance of film or cinema as such?
Yeah.
I mean,
That's an interesting idea.
Deleuze had a lot to say about that.
Oh, God.
But we don't have to take the Deleuzian angle on it. Because I actually haven't read his cinema books, but I've heard they're great.
How about okay. Do we all like film? Because do we all like the idea of a film? Or
Any kind
cinema?
of like film critique or using film or something, I love that. So I mean, I'm definitely for that if that's what we wanted to do.
I've been reading
Okay.
a lot of Neil Postman lately, so I'm basically opposed to any form of visual media.
Yeah. The whole technological determinism thing is a tempting argument. In other words, like the strong McLuhan thesis that the medium is the message, and
Yeah.
You can't communicate anything that isn't already, presupposed by the nature of the medium you choose to communicate it, right? So, but there are good films and bad films, So the medium can be each medium has a sort of entelechy, and so there's a most perfect form of it, and that when that is achieved, we can pretty much just go home. And so in the case of film, what would that pinnacle be? Or maybe this is the wrong way of looking at it.
Room.
The room?
Boom. Yeah, there we go. That was solving the question that is film. Absolutely.
Oh, no.
But I mean, there are some films that sort of intentionally, or even some books that like intentionally try to play with the medium and almost break the medium. You know?
Right, but I guess is deconstruction like the sort of the, are we starting to suggesting that like deconstruction is the sort of like the pinnacle of a given medium, like, or is it sort of a like, are you trying to basically say like, you know, maybe the pinnacle would be to sort of max out all the levers, so like, you know, with film being, you know, pictures in time with sound, like in the same way that maybe like sort of Wagner was trying to maximize the art form that he was working in with like the Ring Cycle or whatever, that something like like it's like an epic movie with musical numbers is like the pinnacle of film. Or you see what I'm saying? Like where, I guess it depends on what criteria you're using.
Yeah, totally.
I had an idea, like, I don't know if this is the pinnacle film, but if you want to talk about someone completely transforming and transcending the medium, I'm thinking of like a director, Tarkovsky, you know, and Tarkovsky, yeah, aesthetics theory was he actually hated Eisenstein's theory of like the montage, this idea, even like this idea that like film is just like a sequence of images are juxtaposed to one another, you know, almost a Hegelian idea of like thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's like this kind of spatialization of images, you know, on wheels. And Tarkovsky saw filming as sculpting in time, which is a much more, like, which in some ways is a much more Bergsonian idea of film, you know, single durations up into like individual frames.
It actually reminds me of Gene Gebser, right? He talks about how like the developing integral consciousness structure, one of the things that makes it unique is a kind of, I guess, an additional emphasis or centrality of temporality, right? Whereas, you know, in previous art forms, like the development of Christian iconography and then later Renaissance art, you have this exploration of space, especially depth, which develops over time. But there's still no temporality to it quite yet. But then with film, you do get that. And so time and space are kind of doing this kind of back and forth thing, whereas time was kind of monopolized by music previously. So yeah.
Music or like dance, or because like they also had theater back then.
Yeah, true.
And I know that Greek theater was very much a multimedia experience. I mean, you know, there was choruses, dance sequences, you know, it wasn't just, you know.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and it served almost a religious function in their society too. It wasn't just, it wasn't entertainment.
Right.
To take.
Is that Luke?
Yeah. I wasn't trying to interrupt you. Finish your thought. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was, it was still sort of like percolating in my head. So go ahead if you have something ready.
Well, my thought was the whole point of film is like storytelling, in my mind anyway. Like the whole idea is to tell some type of story. Doesn't matter what kind of film you're doing. The whole artistic integrity behind it would involve being able to tell whatever the viewer considers to be a good story. And that usually, you know, is representative of the director and the writer and, you know, all that kind of stuff. But isn't for me, when I go to watch a good movie, and I know anecdotal evidence isn't really evidence in and of itself, but whatever. For me, if I'm going to go watch a good movie, I want something that's going to tell a really compelling story, something that's I find that entertaining. And I mean, we call it entertainment, but at the end of the day, we want something similar to that. I mean, that's the whole point of film as a medium, is to tell us some type of story. The interesting parts of the film may be what they're not saying, but there's still a story that's being told. And
So maybe we could talk about like, what is entertainment? What do we find compelling? Like this reminds me of the notion of like catharsis, right? What exactly, what needs exactly are being met by different forms of media?
I don't think any medium has ever been met. I'm a complete pessimist when it comes to movies. Last film that I actually had hope for was Interstellar. I was so excited for this movie. You have no idea. I was like, I love Nolan. This is going to be amazing. We got quantum theory. And what I ended up having was church organs and love will go through the galaxy.
Yeah.
I was
I
very
think Chris needs to reduce his pessimism by about 85%.
I was
so intellectual depth in the majority of the media, especially the stuff that comes out that in like more popular culture, because it's supposed to be popularized, like, and that kind of like depth, while movies can do it really good at the surface level, you have to desire to go deeper. Like I don't really think they're gonna be able to give you that kind of real longing that you have, that I know you have, for that kind of intellectual depth, that I just don't know if it's ever really going to be there in a film. Not anyone that's maintains any kind of serious popularity.
I just think Hollywood has mastered the cliche. Like in the 90s and early 2000s, we had nothing but catastrophe movies like hurricanes, tornadoes, alien invasions. Yeah, and then all of a
Wayne's
sudden,
World 2.
Asteroids.
yeah, then we have all of these movies about superheroes. Like our identity needs to be saved by like Tony Stark or something.
That is a very
I feel-
interesting observation, that the comparison between identity and just the MCU in general, like how we have this need to, I don't know, sort of, yeah, like almost like a savior complex, but on the other end, like we have to be saved somehow. And
Yeah, the Marvel Cinematic Universe seems to be, in a weird kind of way, this revival of almost paganism. You know what I mean? Because you got your gods, right? They kind of seem to be fulfilling a similar psychological or spiritual function. But maybe there's important differences between Apollo and Dionysus and Tony Stark and Batman or whatever, right? What has changed really, and why did that come about when it did? It seems like you had 2001, you had the 9/11, and then the political climate got very anti-religious, especially among leftists, for a long time, and then it seems like after that started to die down, that's right around the time that the whole superhero cult thing started really taking off. So there might be some kind of like underlying cultural dynamics happening there. You know what I mean?
Well, that's
almost
exactly
like an
why.
American.
Yeah. Well, like Luke, like you were saying, that these dumb, sort of intellectually dim films are just such a waste of the potential of the medium. And yet I find those films interesting. Not that Marvel films are dumb or anything, but the big blockbuster films that are so popular that everyone sees, they don't have that intellectual depth, but I still find them interesting because they mirror the culture at that moment. And so they kind of give you insight into what the collective psyche is dealing with at an archetypal level. And so it's a great way to hold a magnifying glass up to like what's going on in the zeitgeist. And I know there's some extent to which like Hollywood and the big production companies are engineering that zeitgeist in a sense, but for the most part, I think the writers that they end up choosing are themselves an expression of it, rather than, it's not so top down, even if there's lots of money and production companies involved. But so I think I have interest in even the corniest films and the big action films or whatever, just because it gives us a sense of the pulse You know, where else can we turn to
sure.
that?
You know, it's
If
funny
you-
though. Oh, sorry. Go on. Go on.
Oh,
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, if you want to know about a culture or about like a group of people, just look at what most interests them, for sure. For sure. I sounded kind of pessimistic as far as that's concerned, but that's not necessarily how I meant it. But yeah, that's a good observation. I like that.
Especially
I mean,
with
we could
children's
try and
movies.
be.
Go
To
ahead.
give like a okay. I
Nate.
didn't interrupt anybody. To give a slight introduction of optimism, contrary to Chris, I mean, you have to remember that, you know, human life is brief, but our art is long. I mean, just think of like all the different like medium forms. Like, how many times have people said the novel was dead before someone reinvented the novel? And I would even argue that I think this might be, I don't know what you would call this heuristic, the Lindy rule, but like, it's interesting that it takes a certain amount of time that technology is first introduced, specifically like a media, some sort of new medium, before it actually begins to fully live up to its actual potential as in this form of aesthetic expression. I mean, when cinematic film was invented, it was mostly used for like, you know, damsels on railroads and like peep shows until like the 1910s. And then you started getting, you know, I'm really not for film, but eventually, you know, you get German expressionism, you get the golden age of Hollywood. So it took, you know, I don't know exactly when film was developed, but several decades from the advent of film to actually became like a real art form. And I think something similar happened with like TV. I mean, my mom, you know, like loved like old TV shows that she watched like the 60s and the 70s, like the Andy Griffith Show and Brady Bunch, and they're really bad.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. Like, people like saw this as like the golden age of television. They were like just stunningly mediocre.
And now we've got Breaking Bad and Chernobyl, and you know,
Exactly. I mean, I think it started with the X-Files. This is my larger thesis I will not get to, but it was practice for all the other shows that came before it. But I think the show that officially started the golden age of television was The Sopranos. You know, and that was in 1999, and that was several decades after, you know, Leave It to Beaver. So I mean, I think we've progressed from, you know, whatever the fuck they were watching in the 1950s to HBO now. So I think it suggests that like easily dismiss a new technology because it takes a while for it to fully mature and actually live to its potential as a force of aesthetic.
I'm not being oh, sorry.
As a force of artistic production.
I'm not trying to be like a pessimist, because I'm not. I'm just trying to be funny, and I'm not. Apparently, I'm not funny.
You're fine.
I think it's so funny because like I'm in Canada. We don't have the great American novel like the American history does with Faulkner and the Beats and everything. But after that kind of coming to age novel, we got like really bad 80s like movies with like, you know, Arnold Schwarzenegger and like Van Damme and like the hero that takes on the world. And then in the 90s, something happened. We had these coming to age movies like American Pie, 10 Things I Hate About You, like the movies that we say we don't like, but we secretly watch on a Friday night when we're by ourselves. Okay. Anyways, but then, like, I don't know where I'm going with this. Maybe I'm just trying to embarrass myself. Oh yes, I was getting back to this. We don't have these like coming to age movies anymore, finding yourself kind of films anymore. I was playing on your
y'all have Justin Bieber. Like, appreciate what you got. Like,
He found Jesus. He really.
You also have Degrassi and Degrassi: The Next Generation.
How do you know more about what we have than I do? It's so bad.
And listen, Canada gave us
I have relatives in Edmonton and Calgary.
Oh,
I mean, the
And
Canadians
the
gave us,
aforementioned useless knowledge. But go on, sorry.
the Canadians gave us Leonard Cohen. I can forgive any shit they hand us down here.
Yes, there's plenty of Canadians that are quite
Jim
quite-
Carrey. I mean, come on.
he was actually born a half an hour from where I live.
Nice.
I'm not, no joke.
And
Oddly enough.
He's quite the philosopher nowadays. I don't know if you've heard him go on one of his
Yeah.
rants. I'm a little worried about him, but it's still more or less compelling.
He did say this one thing, like I forget what like interview it was, but he was like, being cast in the role of Jim Carrey, you know, like was such a great thing for me. Like saying that like his whole personality is like we're all just playing a role or something like that. I was like, okay, that's pretty woke. I'm about that.
I'm gonna bring it back to philosophers, but isn't Charles Taylor Canadian?
Oh yeah.
He
Pretty
is.
sure. Yeah. He's good nose. I'm about to say.
He ran for, but this is the thing that makes me sad. I'm glad you brought this up. This is what really makes me sad. He ran for prime minister, which is the Canadian leader. I know you all know this, but some people watching this won't know this. And it's true. And he lost. He lost to Trudeau. And then we had this great guy. Like he's not a great guy, but he was more or less like a Kantian, maybe Rawlsian, which I don't really like. But anyways, he was philosophical. He was talking about Aristotle and trying to talk about, economics and ethics and philosophy. And the public just hated him. The Liberals lost so bad here. Like the Conservative just like shut up and won. That's twice it's happened that someone has come out, been a public intellectual to a certain degree, and that just I don't know what's
It's
going on.
probably ties in with what we were saying about, the lowest common denominator and popular media and whatnot, right? Like if you get on a stage and you're talking to a crowd of people and you say Aristotle, I mean, their eyes are going to glaze over. You know what I mean? Like, because
So, like,
most
actually,
people are like,
Heresy.
just shut up and tell me something that makes me angry and want to vote for you because,
Wait,
validate
but-
my feelings, right?
The best thing that ever happened was, I forget his name because I would not watch TV the last 4 years, but someone said on, I don't know, either Fox News or CNN, truth is not truth. And I was like, oh my God, this is the most postmodern thing I've ever heard in my entire life. I think it was,
Was that Kellyanne Conway?
Conway.
I think it was Giuliani. I remember this.
Giuliani.
Oh, no.
He basically said
You're
the
right.
truth is not the truth. It's like,
Conway,
whoa.
Conway said we have our alternative facts.
Alternative facts. That's
Yeah,
what it was. Right. Yeah. God, that feels like 50 years ago.
One thing I've always noted, and this is just an interesting parallel between the rise of sophistry, like the late Athenian Empire, and how that really models like the rise of modernism and late capital. Like this, I think it's interesting because when you look at the advent of postmodernism, it was a response to this fear of like the totalitarianism, this idea like maybe we should have like a pluralistic conception of truth. Like maybe there isn't one absolute true, one absolute good, one absolute beautiful thing. And it's just a varying of perspectives. And the thought was, after the Cold War, we'll all have our different opinions, will be no shared reality, but they'll be fine.
What could go wrong?
It was
What could
also
go
modern
wrong?
physics, wasn't it?
Was that?
Yeah. We have a new guest.
Oh,
Dominique D.
Hey, Dominique.
Hi, sorry I'm late.
No worries.
Holy Friday went a little long, but I'm glad to be here. I think,
That just means more holiness.
Christos Anesti.
yeah.
So
You're supposed to say Alithostas Anesti.
I don't know Greek, but yeah, don't let my late arrival interrupt your conversation. It was really interesting.
Tisk tisk.
Oh, we were just talking
Wow.
about how everything is going to hell.
Oh,
Yep.
oh, perfect timing. It's Holy Friday.
There's never
Yeah,
a
but
bad
it's
point
just
to join in on that conversation. So
But
go
it's
ahead,
just
Nathan.
interesting that the biggest products of postmodernism or have actually been like the kind of like new breed of like authoritarian populists that actually undermine any idea of a shared common reality or a shared common good. So I actually kind of think that like a person like Jordan Peterson is right that postmodernism is a threat. I actually think it's because it actually is it actually helps give rise to the far right and its avatars.
So basically
Yeah,
what you're saying
there's
is
a lot
that
of irony. Go ahead.
sorry, I was just trying to kind of recap and maybe restate what you're saying so I confirm my understanding. So what you're saying is that like essentially that sort of postmodernism has knocked loose any sense of like a common shared truth or an sort of objective reality, and that in the political sphere sort of opens particularly democratic societies up to like demagoguery and mythical thinking.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, and it's interesting that in during the Peloponnesian, like you always wondered why Greek philosophers like Socrates and Plato were so obsessed with fighting the sophists, this idea that truth and morality was
just rhetoric. Yeah, right.
It seems like it's a very airy, abstract discussion. You look at the leaders, the end of the Peloponnesian War, like Alcibiades, Cretus, students of the sophists who just believed that truth was just a matter of rhetorical persuasion, and you persuade people to commit atrocities, because all there really was just bodies and language. Language was a drug. You could just manipulate language and make people perceive whatever they wanted to perceive. And I really think that's what we have now, except we have the World Wide Web that can distribute data which manipulates our perception in a way that I don't think anyone could have believed in ancient Greek times.
Well, I feel like the irony of that, though, is that the technological world that we have developed out of the modernist project, and I think part of the whole critique of that postmodernism posed to modernism, I think, is still valid, is that you can science and progress all you want, you're still going to have dozens of bodies in no man's land getting gunned down by Gatling fire. Like, I
think there's a lot of irony in, you mentioned Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson loves to talk smack about Foucault and Derrida and Marx as though they were the ones destroying Western civilization, but the relativism that he's afraid of are actually the conservatives who love him so much. That's where it really seems to be like actually boiling over, as it were, and Pandora's box actually being opened up. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I feel like. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say one thing, because I'm not a postmodernist at all, and I actually despise the entire genre of thinking, and I'm going to tell you why. In a humorous way, it's like Jenga. For me, all it does is put yellow tape around an object. It pulls apart the object, and it gives you a bunch of pieces and nothing left to do with it. I mean, I think this is broadly bad use critique, that like what we have is bodies and language. We get this from the deconstructive gesture from postmodernism. So like the yellow tape goes around it because we're going to deconstruct the power structures, the hierarchies, et cetera, et cetera. But what we get is, okay, fine. Now we have all these pieces on the ground. Now what do we do? And the problem that we have these days is that nobody is putting a model forward. No one's building a model. We have all of these extra pieces from what we've deconstructed over and over and over again. And we don't necessarily have anything to supplement forward. That's my piece.
I see what your Jenga piece. I see what you're saying with the that was so terrible. I see what you're saying about the whole about postmodernism being just pure deconstruction. But I guess is that a problem with postmodernism, or is it just like we had this many years to sort of take stock of where we were at as sort of the world was rupturing at the beginning of the 20th century, and then we kind of had to take stock, see what we wanted to take, what we wanted to leave behind, open up and sort of peel apart the layers that we needed to see where the rot was. And I'll grant that there is a problem in terms of where do we go from here, but is that like the fault? I feel like that's not necessarily something that you can lay at the feet of postmodernism as a failure or like a critique of it. It's just like that was what humanity or like the collective psyche was doing for that much, for that amount of time, and now we're at a new point where we need to synthesize and come up with a new way forward. So I guess maybe is it maybe that you're saying that like if we continue down this road of like continuing to just deconstruct for the heck of deconstruction, that is a problem, because I feel like, do you kind of see what I'm saying? Like, I feel like there was such an obvious sort of strain on the worldview at hand at the beginning of the 20th century that like something had to give. It's almost like an inevitability that deconstruction would have had to happen at that point.
But isn't deconstruction just half the job?
It is,
I mean,
and
if we're
that's what I'm
talking
saying. Yeah.
ethically here, like
Mhm.
so maybe this is just my ignorance of postmodernism, but is deconstruction like strictly a feature of postmodernism, or is that more or less what it's based around?
Oh, you're just speaking your truth, Luke. Don't have to worry about whether you're right or not.
So
You would be wrong in interesting ways. Carry on.
that is what I seek to do. I'd rather be wrong in interesting ways than right in boring ones.
So I guess.
Well,
I mean,
yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So I don't know. I mean, deconstruct. I haven't read my Derrida, but I think he's getting deconstruction from Heidegger, right? And the idea I mean, none of these guys identified as postmodern or as relativists or were like, championing the total dismantling of any source of authority. And the caricatures of postmodernism come from the critiques like from people like Peterson, but I don't think that that's actually, in terms of the philosophers who get pegged as postmodern, they would agree with everything that you were saying, Chris. But the problem is they didn't offer that constructive vision. They were deconstructing something that needed to be deconstructed, which was a sense of truth that was based more on power than it was on legitimate epistemological grounds, right?
Reminds me of an interview that Foucault did at one point, and he's being asked by the interviewer. He's calling the death of man, right, which he saw as kind of like the next logical consequence of Nietzsche's death of God. And the interviewer asks him, okay, well, then what? If we don't have man or God anymore, then how do we orient them ourselves? And he did give kind of a what I think is a horrible answer, honestly. He was just like, well, everybody's going to get mad when their, idols get torn down because it'll be a while before something else gets erected, but that's not my job, something like that. And I was just like, that's actually like a really, like, I didn't like that at all. And I actually kind of like Foucault. So
yeah, I'm surprised because I feel like from my understanding of Foucault, like it's almost like there I feel like there are a couple of postmodern, or again loosely speaking postmodernists, that were trying to do metaphysics, that were trying to sort of push a new way forward. I guess it just, the question then becomes, is their answer satisfying? So like for Foucault, wasn't it basically just like, hey, we need to sort of be honest as to what degree society and human value comes down to a grappling for power, and we should just sort of like lean into that? Is that a misreading of what he's trying to say?
Well, yeah, I don't know Foucault and Derrida as well as I know Deleuze, but the general critique coming out of like the 20th century with eugenics and fascism and all these things, like the response of the postmodernists, so-called, is to say, wow, science was used to justify the power moves of these regimes, and so we need to call truth into question as a truth, as a sociological construct of whoever happened to be in power at a particular moment in history. And that's perfectly valid, but that doesn't mean that science is a fairy tale.
Wanting something for context's sake doesn't invalidate facts. I guess, like, because it sounds like, Matt, what you're saying is like more like contextualizing why certain facts are being used in the way that they're being used. Does that sound like a fair assessment?
Yeah. And part of the problem is we have, I guess, in the Anglo-American world, such a narrow conception of science. We don't have that deeper continental Wissenschaft, like where the human and the natural sciences are understood to be. two sides of the same coin. Because when we include both sides of the coin, you can see how, of course, scientific knowledge unfolds in the context of a cultural and historical dynamic, and it's mediated by all that stuff. But that doesn't reduce the facts about nature to the values of a culture. You have to hold these in tension and find your way through the dialectic without unduly diminishing either side of that.
I'm
We
gonna
have to be
throw
able
it.
to
Oh,
separate these two things. Oh, sorry.
sorry.
Yeah,
No, go ahead.
We're also
Yeah,
First, you go first, Raymond, or
You know what? How about we just scream when we're going to talk? Like, just
Yeah, or just flail around.
Go ahead,
I was
Raymond,
just
and
gonna-
then Nathan.
I was just going.
after Raymond, then Nathan. I want to just say 2 points to Matt's point, but go on. Sorry.
Oh no, I was just gonna name drop someone and then stop talking. But Bruno Latour, and then continue.
Yeah,
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Yeah.
we'll return to that. Go ahead, Nathan.
I think what revealed the strengths, but I think ultimately fatal weaknesses of postmodern and post-structuralist thought, I think, was the Chomsky-Foucault debate, which I think is like the best paradigm of like what public intellectual dialogue should look like, at bar none. And the first part of it was sort of discussing like whether you can isolate a thing called human nature. And I think Foucault, made some good points that in the past, we've tried to sort of say, human beings are political animals, or we are soul beings that are creatures of God, or, we are, or not, or whatever. And when we've tried to extract this ahistorical idea of humanity and try to apply it to every possible social circumstance, the context in which it arises. So even the Marx's idea of the emancipated proletariat was just a universalization of like bourgeois life in the 19th century. And I think these are like very fair points. And Chomsky exceeded that, even though he obviously has his own views about human nature and why an anarcho-syndicalist society is the ideal political constitution for that. But then the second part of the debate went to like, okay, asked the question of like was more focused on politics, like how should our moral or ethical views influence our politics? And Chomsky has whether you agree with Chomsky or not, he has a very particular understanding of human beings as linguistic animals and what that ultimately entails our social and political organization should look like. And Foucault basically said, like, I don't really have a theory. Like it really makes no difference, the justice of the capitalists, exploiting their workers and destroying the biosphere, or the workers, the proletariat's justice of slaughtering them all. Like and Chomsky later said, like, Foucault was the most amoral person I ever met. He wasn't necessarily a bad person. He just didn't really care. And this is really set on display when apparently Foucault covered the Iranian Revolution, I think, for some French newspaper. And he was like talking about how it would be this like new breakthrough in like power relations. And he just sounded like fascinated with, this ongoing political revolution and as it was beginning to take a really violent turn, they were like murdering homosexuals and political dissidents. And he just seemed to be, and he didn't seem to be horrified, but he just seemed to be fascinated. As though these lives didn't really matter. They're just discourses. So I think the problem is that post-structuralist thought can produce a interesting aporas, they point out interesting contradictions that exist that, between, normativity and power, or speech and language in the case of Derrida.
Mm-hmm.
But they just kind of like poke these holes and then just shrug their shoulders and leave. And I think to me, that is the fatal flaw of postmodernist thought. It's just, there's some interesting things we've noticed, and I'm not really going to solve them.
I think I was going to just go back to Matt's point for a second, but I think I'm so glad I'm not the only one hating on postmodernism. Anyways, this is where I get serious here. I think there's two fundamental problems. And the problems stem from Hegel and anti-Hegelianism, because from the Vienna school, right, we get things like we get people fearing encyclopedia, the encyclopedia of knowledge, aka postmodernism par excellence. And then we get things like from A.J. Ayer, where, you know, if you were to say something like abortion is amoral, by the way, I'm not saying anything on abortion, I'm just saying a sentence from that text. And then he, you know, levels that statement to just a boo from, you know, a baseball game or something from the audience. And so what we have here is we have a kind of declining of systematicity and a decline of what a proposition is. And then we get Wittgenstein. And then from Wittgenstein, we get the world is just a bunch of facts. And then from there, we get this kind of philosophy falls even further, and then throw in McCarthyism, and there you go. Now philosophy is trying to, you know, throw itself headfirst into the race with science. And, you know, I'm not a very big fan of Graham Harman. I think he's brilliant in his own right, but he said something that I really, really like. He said he was at a conference and he ran into a bunch of physicists, and they said, you know, when are you philosophers going to step up? Because we need some concepts to think about. I like this idea of philosophers and physicists, you know, theoretical physicists and metaphysicians working hand in hand, pushing ideas out there, working together, as opposed to, oh, you do philosophy. Oh, is the cat on the mat, or is the, you know, the king of France still bald? I mean, like, it's not just postmodernity. It's also, you know, the kind of the brute force of analytic philosophy that like channeled in America and North America. So we have on one end, we have propositions and philosophy of mind and Davidson and Rorty and all of these things emerging. And I know some of you like Rorty, sorry. And then at the other hand, we have, you know, people deconstructing the limits of subjectivity, the limits of truth. And now truth is removed on two barriers. On the front from saying the philosophers can't decide what truth is, only scientists can, because what we can decipher is propositions. And on the other hand, someone saying, well, there is no truth. What we have to work with are intensities or forces. So I think it's a kind of global, or it's a lack in systematicity is what I think. It's a declining in system.
Yeah. Well, you know, you mentioned Wittgenstein, and like, just as Whitehead is entering into philosophy, you know, he publishes his 3 books on relativity theory, and then he goes to Harvard and starts his metaphysical phase. Wittgenstein is telling philosophers that they can't do metaphysics, and that, you know, you just need to be quiet about, you know, of that which we cannot speak. You must remain silent. And so philosophy takes this turn toward just like helping science clarify concepts, not in the sense you were suggesting where there's a real dialogue, but rather science has sole access to the truth. Philosophy can just help clarify the language or whatever. Whitehead was trying to do a reconstructive cosmological project, like build a new scheme in terms of which the world could be understood, not just what relativity and quantum theory were showing, but also religious experience, aesthetic experience, common sense experience. All this can be integrated, and, you know, Whitehead shows one way that it's possible. But yeah, what you're saying is exactly right. Whitehead can help us here, I think. And, you know, Raymond, you brought up Latour earlier, who's sort of, I would say when he's a philosopher, he's a Whiteheadian, but he gets pegged as the postmodernist par excellence, perhaps.
Or like the post-truther, yeah.
He has walked back some of his claims back in the 90s now, and is trying to like do some repair work. But, you know, he has a great paper that's called like, Aren't We Done with Critique Yet? Or something like that, where he's trying to move to this more constructive type of project. And he does draw on Whitehead for that. And I think it's a matter of returning to system, but in an open way. And Hegel seems to have had a more a conception of the dialectic as a process of producing necessity, and that you can actually finish and complete the system. And Whitehead has a different, more pragmatic approach to systemization.
or maybe open system, right? Is
Open,
what you're
Yeah.
trying-
It's
Open
play
system.
as opposed to heading towards some like predetermined telos.
Right. Yeah.
like
So
that.
it's like we can return to system, but in a more open and pragmatic and radically empirical way.
Perhaps
you know-
improvisational.
Yeah.
But you know what's also really funny with, like, as I noticed, our discussions in our Discord server, a lot of us have similar kind of mythical ideas, and there's this kind of new, and I'm not trying to be funny here. There's a kind of new phase, ASMR, people getting into mindfulness, people kind of needing a kind of, spiritual or whatever. They're embracing maybe
Peacefulness.
A new
maybe-
age, if you will.
new age. They're trying to get into kind of more popular ways of dealing with spirituality, and this has been completely excised from philosophy, like contemporary philosophy. Like you mentioned the word God, people clear the room, or you mention any kind of spirituality or metaphysics, and people are just like, okay, all right. And that's all. Sorry, go on, D. I heard you.
Just I didn't mean to interrupt you, Chris.
Oh, sorry. I thought I heard. Anyways, that's what I heard. I thought I heard Dominique. Yeah, that's what I see these three things, right? Like the removal of the encyclopedia, although that was kind of a good thing, and then systematicity, and then this attack on spirituality, and now you have three layers of philosophy that has just fallen to the wayside. Yeah, and now we're trying to make new popular ways of adding it back in there, right? You can't say Christianity because that maybe sound colonial. You can't say, something else or whatever. But it just, I don't know.
It's different ways to meditate.
There you go.
It's almost the same practice, but it's kind of a different form, but at the same time, it still kind of does the same thing.
Isn't
Like
it
referring to
this kind
ASMR.
of resurgence of popular spirituality with ASMR and Reiki and all that woo-woo stuff is also happening at the exact same time as we're getting the MCU and this kind of like neo-pagan Marvel stuff going on, right? It's like those two are kind of stemming from the same place, it seems to me.
Yeah, that is an interesting thought. I think the sort of maybe potentially, well, I don't know about potentially, but it certainly seems to me it's like a pernicious aspect of all this is that like both of those things, the mindfulness push, and the sort of somewhat faddish nature of like, well, basically like anything Gwyneth Paltrow is doing, I guess. And the Marvel Cinematic Universe as being the sort of like the new gods, right? Like this is also entrenched within the capitalist system, right? So it's being commodified, and it's like I think part of the reason why spirituality in general can get so poo-pooed nowadays is because it's hard to commodify something that is ineffable and wild in nature. And so you kind of box it in and limit it and repackage it and secularize it in certain ways. And then you can say, okay, this we can do. And so I kind of wonder to what degree as well, like we're getting these things because that's all that's, for lack of a better phrase, trickling down from this sort of filter of capitalism and commodification. Does that make sense?
So what I'm seeing at work there is basically the immune system of capitalism at work, right? You had the hippie movement back in the 60s.
Right. That's a good way of putting it.
It was all super rebellious and everything, and then it just got commodified and turned into a fad. Punk rock was supposed to burn the system down, and then everybody's walking around with fucking Green Day shirts on, right? Like it's way of neutralizing anything that seems to be a threat, right?
Yeah, it's on that immune system's on overdrive right now with psychedelics. I feel like trying to make sure that experience gets packaged in such a way that it can be, whether it's the medical industrial complex or if it moves more towards the legalization route, the corporations are gonna just find a way to contain the experience so that it doesn't in any way undermine workers' commitment to earning their paycheck.
Yeah. Oh, Nathan.
Nathan, and then I want to hear what Dominique thinks about all this.
Yeah.
Yeah. How linked do you think are, the capitalist order and like scientific materialism? Because increasingly, like I'm thinking of modernity as just having multiple heads, but they're just the same kind of beast. So you mentioned, this, I think, somewhat legitimate worry, as there's, renewed interest in psychedelics and the transformative power, we're not going to treat them like a sacrament indigenous people have across the world, but just as a new SSRI. But I wonder, like, how wedded, like the Dawkins-esque, everything's just, atoms in a void that we need to, instrumentalize and use and exploit, is deeply wedded to, our neoliberal order. I blame Protestantism for this. Atheism is nothing but a extreme and very annoying form of it.
I
If
agree.
you want to see that connection
Okay,
made
Weber.
extremely explicit, then just read anything Steven Pinker has to say about politics.
Yes,
But yeah, go ahead.
Pinker
Yeah.
proves Weber's correct.
Wait, please tell me you're being sarcastic, because that book, his book on enlightenment, which by the way, he only cites two sources. Like,
No,
Is one
I
of them
mean
Steven
that.
Pinker?
No, I mean that Weber's analysis that, capitalism and scientific materialism is just a runoff of Protestantism. That's what I mean. Like, Pinker is a Whig par excellence.
okay.
So I don't know how being a friend of Jeff Epstein falls into it.
Pete and Stinker.
Oh,
Anyways.
By the
eyebrow
way,
content.
now this is top YouTube content. We went from superheroes to postmodernism. I'm telling you.
We're all gonna get rich, guys. It's gonna
That's
be
what
great.
And I'm not
That's-
gonna lie, Christopher, your comment on Richard Rorty, I want to get back to after D said what they have to say. I'm sorry.
Uh-oh.
Oh yeah,
But I
used to
don't
be a
want you to
Rudy
forget
fan,
I
too.
haven't
Talk about
forgotten
that.
about you.
We've already gone over
Just to
time though.
let you
Yeah, the thought that's been kind of sitting with me as I listen to you guys, like especially in response to your point, Chris, about system, is I wonder where the importance of like embodied knowledge or Whitehead's critique of feeling comes in here and kind of helping bridge the gap towards truth, towards kind of mutual understanding or some kind of place to meet. Like the example that pops in my head is the kind of knowledge you get in analysis when you notice the transference in the room. It's not some propositional thing that like is floating around, or even if you've had that for like 6 months, suddenly you feel it, it's in your body. Yeah, there we go. Portable Young. Yeah, it's this kind of, your experience shifts. And I had the same kind of experience when reading philosophers I really like Whitehead. Like I hang out occasionally and read Schelling. And like I can't really understand it that well if I'm just trying to understand the concepts as concepts. I have to like, okay, where is this in my experience? And then it kind of bridges the spiritual kind of ASMR feeling quality with this, with my connection to the world and to other people. So I guess the thing I'm putting in the room is the importance of feeling, an embodied notion of truth.
I really like that. I think that is kind of where I would be heading as well, in the sense of like, when everything is sort of entrenched in power structures that cause people to kind of get conspiratorial and question like the validity of like certain facts or truth claims, then it's like, where else do you try to reach out and form cohesive bonds, which is really, I think, the ultimate project. I don't think it is about knowledge per se. It's really about social cohesion. And I think from there, what you kind of get at is like, okay, how do we have communal experiences? How do we reach across and find common ground? Maybe it is about putting less emphasis on, I hesitate to say this, but just kind of sort of bear with me on that, sort of not so much emphasis on the scientific project and more emphasis on engaging empathy and engaging the things that we can sort of reliably have in common, which might be archetypal in nature. Something collective unconscious,
and so on and so on and so on.
does that make sense?
It does.
So it's almost about
what
sorry, go
Dominique
ahead.
was saying about embodied knowledge is really interesting, because I kind of think we should relate that back to what we were, smack talking capitalism, right? Like, and how that connects with modern materialistic metaphysics. There's this I'm gonna speak Heidegger for a moment, in framing, right? Seeing everything as merely an instrumental means to an end. And so if we can't, slap a grid on something, it's like a threat, right? And so, everything becomes ones and zeros, everything becomes capital in some form or another. And it's like the dominance of that frame of mind has given us capitalism, which is kind of like that frame of mind, but almost like an apotheosis of it. It has become something which is not even in our hands anymore. We're just kind of almost at the mercy of the machine,
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what Jung's critique of modernity is, to a certain degree, is that like we've sort of taken an aspect of the ego, or a particular cognitive function of the ego, and just sort of ran with it, and have continuously like repressed everything that seems unconscious or shadowy or wild. And we kind of are doing that to our own destruction.
Everything that's not clear and distinct is like a potential threat, right?
Yeah, it's like it gets our collective buttholes tightened, and then we don't know what to do. I was gonna say something positive.
Okay, there's where our first someone's gonna comment. Someone's gonna comment about that. These guys are terrible. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry, go on.
Oh, I thought we had crossed the Rubicon about 45 minutes ago.
I think we've said something to make literally everyone on the internet angry thus far. So like we're good. We've got all the bases.
I hope so.
That's the goal. Yeah, I got to run in a minute here, but Dominique, I really love that point. It's crucial. It's central to Whitehead's philosophy. I think Schelling also mentions the need for a critique of feeling in his The Grounding of Positive Philosophy lectures. So, there's some congruence there. But it's one of the issues is, if we were to talk about a sort of the aesthetic ground of reality and aesthesis as a way of sort of breathing together and coming to not know a common world necessarily, but to feel it and to share it at the level of emotion. The problem then becomes the way in which fascism is such a aesthetically compelling,
It's true,
lure. And how do we make sure that we find ways of feeling together and feeling with one another that is maximally pluralistic and never, closed? The same problem with closed systems. We need open systematic thought, and we need pluralistic aesthetics. And is beauty universal? It should be, right? That was Kant's argument. It should be. But often in practice, in actual fact, it's hard to arrive at that without talking over people who have a different view of it. So that's my worry. How do we aestheticize reality in a democratic way?
yeah.
I don't know the answer to that, but
more sublimity, less beauty.
So there you go. There you go.
Sublimity versus beauty. What's the distinction there? Sorry, I might be missing a reference.
Well, Kant's drawn on Burke, right? And its beauty is like finite form. The sublime is more about the infinite. And so you can't close it down and say, this is what it is. It's just more like you're swallowed by it. And yet you
Gotcha.
maintain some sense of your own individuality through that process also. So I like that, Chris. That's a good move. And we should take that up next time as a topic.
All right. Okay. So we can stop recording. If we still want to talk, we can talk.